Hey guys! So, who would buy a Lumix S1 in 2021? Well, the camera got a massive firmware update and is now back from the dead. In this video we'll take a closer look at the new set of features and the new video modes this camera has to offer, and why it actually may be one of the best picks for a sub $2,000 DSLM for this year. So let's check it out. Short disclaimer, in this video you can hear it, there's quite a roomy reverb going on here and it's quite a boring backdrop because right now I'm moving to a new studio and I hope that until next time I have the studio ready. But for now, let's dive into the video. So the Lumix S1 was originally released about 2 years ago and it was marketed as a direct competitor to the Sony a7 III, for example. And over the years Panasonic actually released quite a few new features for this camera. They also released a few other models like the S1H and the S5. Unlike other manufacturers, I'm looking at you, Sony. And after the release of the Lumix S5 last year, there were many disappointed S1 buyers and the camera actually seemed quite dead. But on the 6th of April, Panasonic released a new firmware update for the S1, which includes internal 6K recording and also external RAW recording and many new features for this camera. The camera moves into a territory that lies between the S5 and the S1H, and the camera doesn't seem so dead anymore. So now to the new features. First things first, to be able to access the new firmware update you have to buy the V-Log upgrade for the S1, which already costs about 200 euros. The main new feature of the firmware update is the internal 6K recording for the S1, which also includes a few different recording modes. The highest resolution mode is 5952 by 3968 pixels, which is almost the full sensor readout at an aspect ratio of 3:2. Which is really cool to use the full area of the sensor like in an open gate mode. But in this mode you can only record at 24 frames per second. Next mode is a 5.9K mode, in which you can record at 25 or 30 frames per second. In this mode you can record at an aspect ratio of 16:9. In this mode the camera has a slight crop of 64 pixels, but this one is hardly noticeable at all. The next mode is a 5.4K mode, also at an aspect ratio of 3:2, and in this mode the camera doesn't oversample, so in this mode the camera has a slight crop compared to the open gate mode. When filming in 5.4K you can't utilize the digital stabilizer boost because the camera already uses nearly all of the sensor's area. Panasonic also added the Cinema 4K mode to the S1, which was also available in the S5 before. In this mode you can get an oversampled full frame image at 30 or 25 frames per second. You can also film in 50 or 60 frames a second in Cinema 4K. In this mode the camera just uses the APS-C crop area of the sensor. The Cinema 4K mode has a resolution of 4096 by 2160 pixels. So now let's take a closer look at the quality and the differences of the new 6K modes compared to the old 4K mode. When looking at the used sensor area, we can see that the 4K, the Cinema 4K and the 6K mode really use the full width of the sensor, while as I said before, there is a tiny crop at 5.9K and a slightly bigger crop at 5.4K, since the camera doesn't seem to oversample in this mode. Speaking of oversampling, when we compare the full 6K image with the oversampled 4K image, we can see a slight difference in detail and sharpness. The 6K image seems to have a little bit more detail, but it is only visible when cropping a lot into the image. So when seeing the image at 100%, you hardly notice any difference at all. Also, the dynamic range seems to be more or less the same throughout the different modes. But as Cine D nearly measured half a stop more with the S1H in the 6K mode compared to the 4K mode, it would be interesting to see if the RAW output or the internal 6K recording with the S1 would have any advantages in a test environment. When testing the continuous autofocus, there were hardly any differences between the 4K, the Cinema 4K and the 6K modes. I tested it with the 20 to 60mm lens at f4 and also with the Panasonic 55mm lens at an aperture of 2.8. The camera seemed to perform pretty consistently throughout the different modes. Also, the noise characteristics seem to be pretty similar in the 6K mode compared to the 4K mode, which actually quite surprised me. I thought that maybe the oversampled 4K image would contain a little bit less noise, but it doesn't seem that way. Talking a little bit about codec and bit rates, all of those modes use the long GOP codec on the S1 camera. So Panasonic seems to keep the all-ultra codecs exclusive to the S1H camera, which makes sense because this camera is actually priced quite a lot higher than this one. All of the internal new modes record at 10-bit 420, and all of the modes above 4K record at the bitrate of 200 Mbit and also use the H.265 codec, which gives a better compression quality than the H.264 codec, which the camera uses at the normal 25 or 30 frames per second 4K recording mode. The camera also records at 200 Mbit with the H.265 codec in 4K and Cinema 4K at higher frame rates than 30 frames per second, which means with 50 or 60 frames a second. The old 6K photo mode was also recording at 200 Mbit with the H.265 codec on this camera, so the quality should be more or less the same with the new recording modes. If you want to know more about the 6K photo mode, you can check it out here in this video. So this means that all internal recording modes are now at 10-bit, the 4K modes up to 30 frames a second record at 10-bit 422 with 150 Mbits a second, and everything higher records with 10-bit 420 at 200 Mbits a second with the H.265 codec. So that also means you don't have to worry so much about the speed of your SD cards, since you don't need something like 400 Mbit for the all-I codec, for example. Another important thing is that all the 5K and 6K video modes have a time limit of 15 minutes, and the Cinema 4K modes have a time limit of 30 minutes. And the Cinema 4K modes at 50 and 60 frames a second have a time limit of 30 minutes. In the 6K mode, I started the camera again when the limit was reached, and I could record for an hour without any problems, but it was also quite a cold day at 5 degrees Celsius today. Another cool new feature Panasonic added to the S1 camera is the Anamorphic 4K video recording. In this mode, the camera records at 3328 by 2469 pixels. When recording anamorphic with this camera, you can only use the APS-C area of the sensor, but you can record it up to 60 frames a second. Up to 30 frames a second, the camera records at 150 Mbit with 10-bit 422, and at 50 or 60 frames a second, the camera records at 200 Mbit with the H.265 codec also at 10-bit 420. The camera also offers a variety of different desqueezing options internally. One interesting thing about this, the S5 also has these anamorphic modes, but they are arranged quite differently in the menu between the two cameras. While the S5 has a dedicated option in the menu to activate the anamorphic modes, the S1 just has all the different recording modes, including the anamorphic modes, within the menu, while the S1 has the anamorphic modes listed between the other shooting modes. Another cool feature is the Prores Raw Recording over Hdmi. This one was available before on the S5 and is now activated on the S1, where you can record the 5.9K signal at 12-bit over Hdmi into the Atomos Ninja 5. Panasonic claims that the raw signal from the S1 is identical to the S1H's or the S5's raw signal, although the S1H has a low pass filter which the S5 and the S1 doesn't have. So this has an impact on the image where it comes to moire or sharpness in general, for example. Furthermore, Panasonic finally admitted that the S1 really has a dual gain ISO, and now you can choose between the bass or the gain ISO in the menu, or you can choose the mode where the camera can just choose between all the ISO steps, which includes the bass and the gain ISO. Or you can now display your shutter speed and ISO in decibel or in shutter angle. Especially the shutter angle is really a useful tool I really like to have on a camera. And you also got the red square indicator on the screen, which shows you when you are recording. And the S1 also got timecode output over HDMI. Those are all features the S5 had before, which are now also available in the S1. But there are also some other features the S5 has, which weren't included in this update for the S1. Those are, for example, the master pedestal control, the option to display two different zebras simultaneously, the luminance spot indicator, or the vector scope, for example. Another thing is that the S5 really has much better playback controls than the S1 has, and sadly those either weren't included in this update. So those are the new features Panasonic added to the S1 this year, which in my opinion really lets the S1 look like a completely new camera, which in my opinion actually makes a good buying choice in 21 if you're not relying too much on video autofocus, as you may know about Panasonic. But all in all, although the differences aren't that big between the internal 6K and 4K recording modes, a full frame camera which records 6K internally and Prores Raw over HDMI with that kind of a stabilizer and a good dynamic range is a really good deal for €2,000. I just wish the Panasonic would include the other features from the S5, especially the playback overlay would be great to have on the S1 too. So I really hope this video was useful for you. If you want to know more about the 6K photo mode from the S1, you can watch this video here, and please don't forget to subscribe and hit the like button, and until next time, see you!